So this video is about the characteristics of life. And finally, we're starting a little bit of biology. And just in case you don't know, and I hope you do know this, but I don't know, maybe you don't, that biology, ology is means study of, and bio means life. Think about biography. It's the story of someone's life. Biology is the study of life, not somebody's life, but life altogether. So we're going to talk about the characteristics of life, and this fits into our taxonomy unit or our classification unit. And so the questions that we're going to talk about today are, what does it take to be alive, and how do we classify something to be alive? And when I say the word alive, what I really am talking about is to be currently alive or once alive, as opposed to non-living. So when we talk about alive, being dead counts in some way because that thing was once alive. But when we're talking about non-living things, these are things that have never been alive. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So here are the targets. I want you to copy these down, pause if you need to, and then move on. Number one, you can list the characteristics of life. And two, you can explain and give an example of how organisms maintain homeostasis. Okay? So pause if you need to, and if not, here we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first one is the list of characteristics of life. I'm going to list them and just talk about them very, very briefly. So the first one is homeostasis, which should be a familiar term to you from middle school. And in case you don't remember what this word means, it's the ability to maintain a stable internal environment, especially when the environment changes. Now this could be even in small changes in temperature or pH or something like that. So excuse me one second. Sorry about that. Sorry for the interruption. That was my mom calling. So okay, so now I'm back. So let me give you some examples. I don't remember what I was saying right before, but let me give you an example, actually two examples of how an organism maintains homeostasis. So that is actually target number 2, that you can explain and give an example of how organisms maintain homeostasis. And I think the first one is quite obvious, and you probably learned this one before. The first one is temperature. All organisms must maintain an internal temperature. And the easiest one to think about for us is us. So I think you know this already. Your internal temperature is something about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. It's somewhere near that, and our body works really hard to maintain that that temperature, because there's a lot of other things that are dependent on that temperature. There's a lot of biochemistry, and we'll learn a little bit about this later in the year. There's biochemistry that's dependent on this temperature, and if the body doesn't maintain this temperature, then the biochemistry doesn't work, which then could lead to death. So it's really important that we maintain something close to this, and that's why it's extra risky when you get a fever or an extreme fever, and your temperature increases quite a bit. So your body maintains that temperature, that when you're cold, you shiver, and your body is shaking, your muscles are contracting, you're burning ATP, which we're going to talk about, and converting that chemical energy of ATP into heat, and you warm your body up. But when you're hot, your body sweats and releases liquid, sweat, onto your skin, so that the heat from your skin is transferred into that sweat. and your body cools down. You might also notice that when you're really hot, your face becomes flushed, becomes reddish because blood is rushing to your face or to your outer skin to release some of the heat that it's carrying in it. But when you get in the cold, your hands, your fingertips turn white because the blood is being constricted to your core, the core of your body, around your internal organs, so it doesn't lose heat from your extremities, your fingers, your hands, your feet, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's one way that we maintain temperature. All organisms have to maintain that temperature, one way or another. I'll give you another example, and that's pH. If you remember what pH is, this is really a way that we measure the acidity, basicity, or alkalinity of a solution. So our body has different solutions in it, different pHs in different places. Your mouth has a different pH or level than your stomach, and that's different than your intestines. But it's important that each section of that maintains a certain internal environment for the biochemistry to work. And the way that we maintain that is something that we call buffers, and these are chemicals that that maintain the I'm going to put desired pH, because we're not consciously desiring that, but our body wouldn't function if it didn't maintain that pH. Okay, enough said, I think. So we got homeostasis as one of the characteristics of life. The next is cells. So all living things are made out of cells. So jot that down. I'm not going to copy that, but I want you to write that all living things are made out of at least one cell. There are some living things that are unicellular, that they respond to the environment, which is kind of related to homeostasis. But as there's an environmental change or a stimulus, living things respond to that stimulus. All living things use energy. And I'll actually add, they also use nutrients, but energy in one form or another. And most of the time, the energy that we use comes in the form of ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. And this is just chemical energy. We're going to learn more about it later in the year. It's chemical energy. All living things as a population adapt. And it's not that you adapt to a certain environmental condition, but this is really in terms of evolution and populations adapting. And we'll learn a little bit about that later in the year. All living things grow and develop. And they're not the same thing. Grow means essentially it's to get bigger, and develop is to change throughout one's lifetime. So the way I think about this is like a caterpillar grows. It starts as a little tiny caterpillar, and it grows to be a bigger caterpillar, but then it develops into a butterfly. Think about the human life life cycle or growth or developmental stages. So you go from an infant, from a newborn to an infant, to a toddler, to a child, to a teenager, to a young adult, to an adult, to a senior. So you go through different changes, different things happen to your body in that time, and you're not growing or getting bigger, but you're developing. So there's two separate ideas, but we put them together for this list. That all living things have some form of organization. It's not a random set of things all working together. So if we're talking about a single cell, we've got what, if you remember from 7th grade, cell organelles. If we're going to be talking about different tissues within an organism, but at least there's some form of organization. And lastly, that there's reproduction, that living things are able to reproduce, and that's why we have things that are still alive, because we wouldn't exist here if our ancestors were not able to reproduce. So all living things have the capacity to reproduce, at least as a population. Okay? So there are some exceptions, or possible exceptions to this rule, but we'll talk about those in class. And let me give you a mnemonic that might help you remember this list. We start with homeostasis. Talk about cells, responding to the environment, energy, adaptation, growth and development, organization, and reproduction. H. Krigor. It's like somebody's name. Like, I don't know, Howard Krigor. But H. Krigor might be a good way to try to remember this list, but it is something that you're going to need to know. So let's go back to this list. I think we're almost done here. You can list the characteristics of life. That might take a little bit of time. So practice that. Make yourself flashcards. Do whatever you need to do to learn these correct characteristics of life. And then be able to give me an example of how organisms maintain homeostasis. Make sure you understand this word. You know it. But give me both of those examples. And actually, here's a challenge. Can you think of other examples? Anything else that you know of how organisms maintain homeostasis? And then I'm probably going to forget to ask you about that. So please raise your hand and share. And if you've got a good one that other students don't have, I'll give you guys a success pass. Okay? So I'll give that student a success pass. But if you got those, we're squared away, and I believe that's all.